In the spring of 1984, long before anyone in California knew the name Richard Ramirez, a quiet neighborhood in Glassell Park became the starting point of a nightmare. It happened inside the home of a 9-year-old girl. She was asleep in her bedroom when an intruder slipped in through an unlocked window. He moved with purpose, not randomly, not like a typical burglar looking for valuables. He went straight to her room. The girl later said she woke up to the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, close to her face. The man covered her mouth so she couldn't scream, lifted her from the bed, and carried her out of the house. He took her to a nearby location, assaulted her, and then left her there, alive but terrified. Miraculously, she managed to find help. For detectives, this case was disturbing but confusing. The attacker didn't match the profile of a typical predator. He left almost nothing behind. He didn't speak. He didn't take money or valuables, and he vanished into the night before anyone even knew he'd been there. At the time, police viewed it as an isolated attack. Horrifying, but not connected to anything larger. No one realized this was the first strike of someone who would soon terrorize Los Angeles and San Francisco with a level of unpredictability investigators rarely see. Looking back, this moment, that quiet window, that silent entry, that early morning panic, was the beginning. The first known crime of a man who fed on fear, moved like a shadow, and left entire neighborhoods sleeping with their lights on. He was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, into a family that was already struggling. His father was a strict, volatile man who worked long hours on the railroad. His temper was known in the house, and the kids grew up learning to stay quiet when he was in one of his moods. His mother was hardworking but overwhelmed, trying to manage 5 children while dealing with the stress inside the home. Richard was the youngest of the siblings, and he often felt pushed out of the way. The quiet one nobody really noticed. His older brothers got into trouble early, drifting into crime, drugs, and street life. Richard watched it all closely, picking up patterns most kids never see. School didn't offer him much escape either. Teachers described him as distant, distracted, and often half asleep at his desk. He struggled academically, not because he lacked ability, but because he was rarely mentally present. He'd stare out windows, drift off during lessons, and avoid eye contact. Kids didn't pick on him much. He wasn't loud enough to attract trouble, but he wasn't really part of any group either. Just a quiet kid fading into the background. But the biggest influence of all came from outside the immediate family. His older cousin, Miguel. Miguel had returned from the Vietnam War deeply damaged. He showed Richard graphic photos from his time overseas. Things no child should ever see. Bloody Polaroids, war trophies, stories told with a grin instead of shame. Richard soaked it in. Not scared, just silent. Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard was in the room when Miguel shot his own wife during an argument. A child watching a killing at point-blank range. That event broke something inside him. After that, Richard began spending more time alone, staying out late, sleeping in graveyards, drifting away from anything normal. It didn't happen overnight, but the path was already forming. A violent home, an unstable mind, older brothers getting into crime, a war-traumatized cousin showing him horrors, and a moment that shattered whatever innocence he had left. This was the foundation, the beginning of the darkness that would surface years later in Los Angeles. As Richard reached adulthood, he slipped deeper into a life lived at night. He drifted between cheap motels, bus stations, and strangers' couches, never staying anywhere long enough to build connections. He blended into the underbelly of Los Angeles, a city big enough for someone like him to disappear completely. He began breaking into houses regularly. At first it was for money or anything he could sell quickly. But it didn't stay that way for long. The thrill meant more to him than the valuables. He moved silently, slipping through windows and doors like he'd been studying it his whole life. Drugs became part of his routine. They kept him awake for days, wandering the streets, slipping into alleyways, riding buses until sunrise. The more disconnected he became, the more his crimes escalated. His burglaries turned unpredictable and chaotic. Sometimes he took things. Sometimes he destroyed things. Sometimes he just watched people sleep. Police had no idea who he was. To them, he was just one of countless petty criminals drifting through the city. But to Richard, these nights were shaping something far darker, something deliberate. The pattern hadn't fully formed yet, but the shadow of the Night Stalker was already there waiting. The turning point came in June 1984. Up to that point, police saw Richard Ramirez as just another drifter, a burglar, a nobody. But that changed overnight. Inside a small Los Angeles apartment, an elderly woman named Jenny Vinkow was found dead. The scene shocked officers. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Whoever entered the home moved silently, slipped through a window without waking neighbors, and attacked with a level of aggression that didn't match petty crime. The victim had been stabbed repeatedly, and the room showed signs of a fierce struggle. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no clear motive. But the part that disturbed detectives most was the sheer brutality and the fact the suspect stayed in the home longer than any normal intruder would have. Something about it felt deliberate, personal, controlled. The detectives didn't know the name Richard Ramirez yet, but they knew the killer wasn't finished. The violence was too intense, the intrusion too calculated. This wasn't someone who panicked. This was someone who enjoyed slipping into homes at night. And it didn't take long before more cases began surfacing. Break-ins with the same style. A man entering houses while people slept. Sometimes stealing, sometimes hurting, sometimes just watching. In one home, he assaulted a woman but left her alive, a disturbing mix of control and chaos. In another, he used the same approach. Late-night entry, sudden violence, fleeing into the darkness. Police realized they weren't dealing with random crimes anymore. They were dealing with a night predator who moved fast, left almost nothing behind, and struck without warning. The fear inside the department was simple. If he wasn't stopped soon, the city was going to face something far worse. After the first killing in 1984, investigators were still unsure what they were dealing with. But as the crimes escalated into 1985, the tone of the scenes began to shift. And this is when the occult signs first appeared. During one of the early attacks, police discovered something that immediately stood out. A pentagram crudely drawn on a bedroom wall, smeared in a rushed, chaotic way that made detectives wonder if it was a message or a taunt. Nothing graphic. Just the shape itself, but it was enough to raise concerns. In another home, a pentagram appeared on the victim's thigh, drawn with what looked like makeup or lipstick. It was done quickly, almost scribbled, as if the killer didn't care about precision, only about making a point. Victims who survived began reporting the same chilling detail. The attacker spoke about Satan, muttering strange phrases, repeating the same dark themes over and over. Some said he demanded they swear to Satan.
I swear!
Others said he chanted words they didn't understand, but the tone alone filled them with fear. To police, it didn't feel like a ritual. It felt like intimidation, a way to inject pure terror into the crime. The symbols weren't neat or ceremonial. They were messy, impulsive, and delivered with the same chaotic energy as the attacks themselves. But the effect on the investigation was immediate. Detectives were forced to consider that the intruder wasn't just breaking in. He was sending a message. Something personal, something theatrical. Something meant to terrify both the victims and the city. As more cases lined up, a pattern emerged. Nighttime break-ins, random victims, homes entered silently, satanic references whispered to survivors, pentagrams appearing at multiple scenes. By now, investigators were dealing with a criminal who didn't just want to take lives. He wanted to create fear, to control the narrative, and to give himself an identity rooted in darkness. This was the phase where Los Angeles first realized their killer wasn't just a murderer, he was building a persona, and the media would soon give that persona a name. And that name would freeze the entire city. They called him the Night Stalker. A figure who slipped silently through neighborhoods, striking without warning, leaving behind homes torn apart, terrified survivors, and scenes that made detectives realize this wasn't just a criminal. This was someone who felt empowered by fear itself. The moment the media released the name, panic spread like wildfire. Locksmiths were overwhelmed. People boarded up windows. Gun sales surged overnight. Every shadow felt dangerous. But while Los Angeles was trying to protect itself, he was already moving on. Already searching for his next target. Already pushing deeper into the darkness he had created. Because for him, the name wasn't a warning, it was a badge of power. By late summer of 1985, everything had changed. The Night Stalker was no longer a ghost slipping through shadows. He was the most hunted man in California. Detectives across the Los Angeles Police Department were working around the clock. Patrol units doubled. Tips flooded in. And for the first time, they finally had something solid to work with. A footprint, a make of shoe, a rare size that barely sold in the United States. It wasn't much, but it was enough to link multiple scenes together with certainty. And every new incident repeated the same pattern. Forced entry, chaos, violence, and stolen items that later appeared in pawn shops or on the street. Then came the big break. A car, abandoned, wiped down, but not perfectly. Detectives found a single fingerprint on the rearview mirror. When it was run through the system, everything snapped into place. A name, a face, a man already known to police for burglary and drug use. Richard Ramirez. And suddenly the hunt shifted. This wasn't just tracking a shadow anymore. This was tracking a real person. A man with a past, a pattern, and now a face plastered across every news bulletin in the city. The moment his photo hit the front pages, Los Angeles went silent. People stared at the image in shock. Because the monster lurking in the night wasn't some imagined figure. He was real. He was alive. And now he was running. It happened in broad daylight. A woman in East Los Angeles looked up and froze. The face from the newspaper was walking toward her. For a split second, she doubted herself. Then she screamed, "El Matador!" The words cut through the street. Heads turned. People stepped outside. Someone else recognized him. He saw the shift in their faces, and he ran. But this wasn't the darkness he hid in. This was daylight. Neighbors poured into the street. Men chased him through yards and over fences. He tried to steal a car. The driver fought back. More people joined in. He was struck, dragged down, surrounded. The man who had terrorized a city from the shadows was now on the ground in full view of it. When police arrived, they found him beaten, restrained, and held by the public. The Night Stalker had not been caught in the night. He had been hunted in the sun. When police finally took Richard Ramirez into custody, the city exhaled. He was charged with 13 murders along with multiple counts of attempted murder, burglary, and sexual assault. The scale of the case was staggering. Victims ranged from children to the elderly. There was no pattern beyond randomness and terror. The trial began in 1988. Ramirez entered the courtroom defiant. He showed no remorse. At one point, he raised a pentagram drawn on his palm and declared allegiance to Satan. He smiled at cameras, smirked at families of victims, treated the courtroom like a stage. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, ballistics, eyewitness testimony, stolen property. Survivors identified him. Forensic science tied him to multiple crime scenes. But something darker was happening outside the courtroom. Ramirez began receiving letters, hundreds of them. Some from women who claimed they loved him, some who said they believed he was misunderstood. A small but vocal group became obsessed with him, attending court, writing daily, calling him attractive, even proposing marriage. It shocked the public. While families grieved, he gained admirers. In 1989, the verdict came. Guilty on all major counts. The jury recommended death. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to die in California's gas chamber. He responded with a chilling statement to the courtroom, dismissing morality, mocking death, and promising that he would be remembered. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for decades. But despite the sentence, the fascination with him never fully disappeared. Despite the death sentence, Richard Ramirez did not fade into obscurity. In 1996, while on death row at San Quentin State Prison, he married one of his most devoted supporters, Doreen Leoy. She had written to him for years, convinced he was innocent, or at least misunderstood. Their relationship grew through letters and prison visits. Under California prison rules at the time, death row inmates were not permitted conjugal visits. There is no verified evidence that Ramirez fathered any children while incarcerated. Rumors circulated, but none were confirmed. While some saw him as a monster, others saw something entirely different. A rebel, an anti-hero, a dark fantasy. Psychologists call this phenomenon hybristophilia, a paraphilia in which a person is sexually attracted to someone who has committed outrageous or violent crimes. For some women, notorious criminals represent danger without personal risk. A man who is controlled, contained, unable to truly harm them. For others, it's about fame. Infamy becomes magnetism. They are drawn to the spotlight surrounding the crime. There is also the rescuer complex and the belief that they alone can understand, heal, or redeem someone the world has condemned. Ramirez received hundreds of letters. Some professed love, some offered marriage, some sent money. The fascination never completely disappeared, but the death sentence was never carried out. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at the age of 53 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma while still on death row. He was never executed. His body was cremated. His ashes were released to his family. There is no public grave for the Night Stalker. The man who thrived in attention ultimately left the world quietly in a prison hospital bed. And yet, decades later, his name still resurfaces in documentaries, books, and online forums. Not because of glamour, but because fear leaves a long shadow. That cold January morning in 1974, Dennis Rader chose a quiet family home on a normal Wichita street, the Oteros. Inside were two parents and two young children starting their day like any other. Rader didn't burst in wildly. He slipped in early, waited, and confronted the family one by one as they arrived inside. At first, he acted like a burglar looking for a car and money, trying to keep them calm while he took control of the situation. When he realized the father and mother were cooperating, he tied them and the children up. Throughout the entire event, the family were terrified but hopeful it would end with him simply leaving. They were told repeatedly he just wanted their car. But that wasn't the truth. Rader had already made up his mind long before he ever stepped inside that house. One by one, he ended the lives of the parents first, then the young boy. He kept control of everything, taking his time and following the plan he'd built in his head. And then there was the young girl, 11 years old. She was the last one left alive in the house, and the most frightened. Rader isolated her from the others and took her into another room. She was still hopeful that she might survive, still trying to make sense of what was happening. When he finished, he left her in that room, alone, the same way he'd left the others, tied, helpless, and with no chance to escape. There was no mercy in any part of his actions. What stands out most is the coldness, the complete lack of hesitation, even when a child was right in front of him. He didn't rush out. He walked through the house calmly, knowing exactly what he had done, gathering a few small personal items before quietly leaving through the back door. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Kids getting ready for school, people heading to work. No one had any idea that inside that small family home, 4 lives had just been taken, including a little girl who should have been starting her day like everyone else. That moment became the beginning of BTK's long, haunting shadow over Wichita. Dennis Lynn Rader grew up in Kansas, Raised in a conservative, church-going family that valued routine, hard work, and keeping your head down. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about his childhood. He wasn't the type of kid people remembered for causing trouble, and he wasn't the type teachers talked about either. He blended in. Quiet, polite. Invisible in all the ways that made him dangerous later. As he got older, that pattern continued. Rader served in the military for a short period, then returned home and built what most people would call a respectable, ordinary life. He married young, started a family, and created an image of a responsible husband and father. In public, he played the role perfectly. He went to church, helped with community groups, and acted like the kind of neighbor who'd wave at you while mowing the lawn. Behind that mask, though, things were very different. Rader lived with a growing obsession for control. He developed fantasies he kept completely hidden, fantasies built around dominating others. He learned early on how to keep his inner world locked away while presenting a friendly smile on the outside. His family never saw anything unusual. Friends thought he was a little stiff, maybe a little too serious at times, but nothing more. His work life matched the same pattern. Rader held several jobs over the years, most of them routine and unsuspicious. He worked in meatpacking, he spent time in security roles, and eventually landed a position with ADT Home Security, a job that gave him access to people's houses, alarm systems, and floor plans. At the time, nobody realized how dangerous that opportunity was. To everyone else, he was just another employee doing a normal job. At home, he was the image of a quiet father. His wife cooked meals in their tidy kitchen. His daughter played on the floor, and Rader sat calmly reading the newspaper like any other suburban husband preparing for work. There were no outbursts, no strange behavior, nothing that made his family suspect the double life he was already living.
All right, sweetie.
He knew exactly how to mask the shift between ordinary family man and something much darker.
One more time.
By the time the Otero murders happened, Rader wasn't some chaotic stranger who snapped. He was a man who had been building two versions of himself for years. One everyone saw and one nobody knew existed. He could sit at the breakfast table with a calm smile, walk out the door like any other dad heading to his job, and then vanish into a completely different mindset the moment he was alone. And that split, that ability to move between normal life and criminal fantasy without ever slipping up, is what made him so difficult to detect in the beginning, and why Wichita had no idea the man they were about to fear for decades was already living quietly among them. When the Otero murders were first discovered, it wasn't by detectives or neighbors. It was by two of the older Otero children returning home from school. What they walked into immediately told them something was terribly wrong. Their panic spread down the street, and within minutes, police were rushing to the house. In Wichita, news like this traveled fast. Families who had always felt safe suddenly felt exposed. People locked their doors for the first time, checked their windows twice, and wondered how something like this could happen in their quiet neighborhood. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't a typical crime. Nothing was chaotic or rushed. Whoever did it moved with control, and that unnerved investigators more than anything. They interviewed neighbors, combed the property, and looked for fingerprints. But the scene offered almost nothing that pointed to a suspect. There was no clear motive and no obvious connection to the family. As days passed with no solid leads, pressure on the police grew. Reporters called constantly. Residents demanded answers. Behind closed doors, investigators debated whether they were dealing with someone who planned this carefully, someone who might strike again. And while the city tried to make sense of what had happened, the person responsible quietly returned to his normal life, watching the aftermath unfold exactly the way he expected it to. In the weeks after the Otero murders, Wichita police made a decisive move. They formed a dedicated task force. A small group of detectives pulled from different units and told to treat the case as a priority. Their job wasn't to speculate or re-explain what happened. Their job was simple: find whoever did it. While the task force organized itself, Dennis Rader quietly shifted into what he later called his projects. These weren't crimes, not yet. They were ideas. Fantasies he turned into plans. He started studying neighborhoods, taking note of routines, watching houses from a distance, and deciding who might become one of his future projects. He kept lists, notes, sketches, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to feed the part of him that had started long before the Otero murders and wasn't going away. For the police, the task force marked the beginning of a serious, structured hunt. For Rader, it marked the beginning of his next phase. Patient, deliberate, and hidden in plain sight. In April 1974, only a few months later, he chose another target, a young woman named Catherine Bright. Rader spent days watching her home, studying the routine the same way he had before. When she left, when she came back, when the house fell quiet. He slipped inside while the place was empty and waited. When Catherine walked through the door, Rader revealed himself and tried to take control in the same cold, methodical way he'd practiced. But this time, things didn't go according to plan. Catherine's brother unexpectedly arrived home. A violent struggle broke out, chaotic and unpredictable. Rader panicked but forced his way through, leaving both siblings critically hurt before fleeing the scene. Catherine didn't survive. Her brother did. And his description of the attacker became one of the first real leads the Wichita police ever received. For investigators, it was the moment they realized the Oteros weren't an isolated case. Someone was hunting people in their community. And he wasn't done. Over the next several years, Dennis Rader claimed more victims across the city. He didn't follow a pattern the police could easily track. Different neighborhoods, different homes, even different methods. The only thing that stayed consistent was the planning. Every attack was carefully chosen, and every detail was part of what he called a project. But what made Rader stand out wasn't just the crimes. It was the way he communicated. He began sending the police messages, handwritten letters, cryptic notes, even packages he left around Wichita. Inside them were drawings, maps, clues, and strange codes only he understood. Sometimes he described his crimes as if they were stories. Other times he taunted detectives, challenging them to catch him. Each message was meant to prove he was still in control. Then, without warning, he stopped. Years passed with nothing. No letters, no packages, no clues. The city moved on and detectives began retiring, still believing the man behind the messages had vanished or died. But he hadn't. After decades of silence, Rader started writing again. The tone was the same. Confident, taunting, and desperate to prove he was still the one calling himself BTK. It was his return to the spotlight, and the beginning of the mistake that would finally expose him. For more than 30 years, Dennis Rader managed to hide in plain sight. But in 2005, everything finally came undone. After years of silence, Rader began contacting the police again. Letters, puzzles, and questions he thought only he could answer. He wanted attention, and he wanted to control the story. One of those messages asked if a computer floppy disk could be traced. Detectives told him it couldn't. He believed them. That was his mistake. When the disk arrived, forensic analysts examined the metadata hidden inside the files. Buried in the data was a username, Dennis, and a location tied to a church computer in Park City, where Rader served as a church leader. Detectives moved fast. They followed his movements, checked his old reports at work, and quietly gathered enough evidence to make a move. Finally, on a cold February day in 2005, officers pulled over Rader during a routine traffic stop. He stepped out of the vehicle calm and collected, completely unaware that his life as BTK was over. Inside the interrogation room, he barely resisted. Hours later, he began talking, not with emotion, not with remorse, but with the same cold detail he had kept hidden for decades. He admitted to multiple murders, describing them exactly the way he had planned them, as projects. By August 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. No chance of parole. He was taken to a maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his life cut off from the community he once terrorized. BTK was finally caught. The city could breathe again. Today, Dennis Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He spends his days in near total isolation, far removed from the community he once terrorized. His family were devastated by the truth. They had lived ordinary lives, completely unaware of the monster hiding in their own home.
All right, sweetie.
His daughter later said the man she knew as her father died the moment he was unmasked as BTK.
One more time.
Aileen Wuornos came into the world on a freezing February morning in 1956, in a small Michigan town where winters bit hard and people kept to themselves. She didn't arrive into a warm family home or a steady pair of hands. Her life started in chaos long before she was old enough to understand it. Her mother was barely more than a kid herself. Her father wasn't around, locked away, drifting in and out of places most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Aileen and her brother Keith were left with grandparents who felt more like wardens than caretakers. The house they grew up in wasn't the kind where birthdays were celebrated or bedtime stories were read. It was the kind of home where voices rose too fast, tempers snapped too easily, and comfort was a rare visitor. From a young age, Aileen learned that the safest place in the house was outside of it. She spent long hours wandering the woods behind the property, lighting small fires, throwing stones at trees, sitting alone by frozen ponds trying to keep warm. She wasn't escaping boredom. She was escaping the feeling that she didn't belong anywhere. School didn't give her much relief either. The other kids saw her rough clothes, her short fuse, the way she flinched at loud noises. They mocked her, pushed her, whispered about her. She got into fights, not because she wanted trouble, but because it was the only way she knew to defend herself. Every year she seemed a little more detached, a little more wild, as if she was building armor without realizing it. By the time she reached her early teens, the tension at home cracked completely. Arguments became explosions. Aileen started spending nights away, in abandoned cars, makeshift camps in the woods, anywhere she felt she could breathe without being shouted at. She was barely a teenager, but already living like someone twice her age. Money, of course, was a problem. She had none. No safety net. No adult she trusted. And surviving meant figuring out ways to eat, to keep warm, to get by. That's when she slipped into a way of life that left her exposed, vulnerable, and constantly at risk. She would meet men by the roadside, offering whatever she could in exchange for enough cash to make it through the night. It wasn't a choice. It was a last resort. The kind of survival strategy that leaves scars no one can see. And this became her world. Drifting through nights, hitching rides, meeting strangers, taking chances. She learned quickly how dangerous people could be, how fast a situation could turn, how fear feels when you can't call for help. It wasn't long before she stopped expecting kindness from anyone. She moved through the world braced for the worst, quick to defend herself, quicker to run. The lines between threat and safety blurred. Every encounter felt unpredictable. Every man she met felt like someone who could hurt her. As she drifted down to Florida in her 20s, her life had become a constant loop. Motels, bars, long stretches of highway, strangers' passenger seats, and those roadside encounters that paid just enough to keep her moving. She survived on instinct, sharp, twitchy, always ready. And beneath it all, a lifetime of anger and fear simmered, untouched, unprocessed, waiting for something to set it off. By the time she met Tyria Moore, the first person she truly attached herself to, Aileen was already shaped by decades of abandonment, violence, and survival at any cost. Loving someone didn't soften her edges, it only added pressure. Because now she needed money not just for herself, but for them both. And she had nothing left but the only way of earning she'd known for years. That's where the slow, quiet slope of her life finally tipped. Where desperation met danger, where fear collided with violence. and where the story everyone knows truly begins. Aileen's world tightened fast once money ran out. The pressure kept building night after night until something finally snapped. She'd been hustling for years, drifting through bars, truck stops, and lonely stretches of highway. But now she wasn't just doing it to survive. She was doing it because she felt trapped. Every bad night meant letting Tyria down. Every empty pocket felt like another failure. And somewhere inside all that strain, something in Aileen shifted into survival mode with no brakes left. It started on those quiet back roads in Florida, the places where people slowed down not because they wanted company, but because they knew no one else was watching. Aileen met them the same way she always had, through rolled down windows, awkward small talk, and the hollow promises of quick cash. But she was different now. Harder. Tenser. More afraid of what she might lose than what might happen out there. The first killing didn't explode suddenly. It crept in. Aileen later claimed she felt threatened, that she panicked, that something inside her took over in the moment. Whether that was fear, anger, or something darker, no one can truly say. What is clear is that once that line was crossed, she couldn't uncross it. The gun in her hand became the one thing in her world that gave her a sense of control. Control she had never had growing up, never had at home, never had with men on those lonely roads. After the first shooting, Aileen didn't run. Not in the way most people imagine. She simply kept moving, drifting from motel to motel with Tyria, paying for rooms with whatever she'd taken from the scene. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't
How much for
clever.
this?
It was desperate. She used her victims' belongings out in the open, driving their cars, pawning their tools, spending their cash, leaving a trail for detectives to follow long before she realized the walls were closing in. Over the next year, the pattern repeated. Hitchhiking, roadside deals, men who thought they were picking up someone vulnerable. Aileen's story shifted each time. Sometimes she said she acted in self-defense. Sometimes the details changed. But the outcome was always the same. Another man gone. Another set of belongings pocketed. Another motel room paid for. And Tyria, always there, never asking too many questions, always needing the money but never wanting the details. Detectives across several counties began seeing the same things. Abandoned cars, missing men, pawned items with the same signatures. Different towns, same pattern. They didn't know her name yet, but they knew they were looking for a woman. A hitchhiker who drifted through bars and motels, someone who vanished right after each man did. It didn't take long for them to narrow it down. By late 1990, Aileen and Tyria were staying in cheap motels, burning through cash faster than they could get it, and the police were right behind them. When one of the stolen cars crashed near a bar, witnesses saw Aileen stumbling away from the scene, looking rough, panicked, and out of breath. That was the moment detectives finally had a face to match the rumors. She didn't know it, but her time on the road was running out. The pressure she'd been living under for years had pushed her into a corner she wasn't going to escape. And once Tyria got frightened enough to step back, the world Aileen had built, the fragile, desperate one, started collapsing fast. That's where the hunt for her truly began. After months of drifting through motels, pawn shops, and lonely highways, Aileen's world finally closed in on her. It didn't happen in a dramatic chase, it happened quietly, inside a rough biker bar in Port Orange. Detectives had already followed her trail through car sightings, motel receipts, and pawn shop slips. And when she and Tyria crashed that car and walked away from it, leaving fingerprints and items behind, investigators finally had everything they needed. Tyria panicked first. She left Florida and ended up in Pennsylvania, scared of getting dragged any deeper. When detectives reached her, they offered a deal, full immunity if she helped them. She agreed. For days, she made recorded phone calls telling Aileen she was scared, that she needed the truth, that the police were pressuring her. Aileen folded under that emotional weight. She didn't confess to detectives. She confessed to Tyria, and that was enough. Police moved in fast. Aileen was arrested outside the Last Resort biker bar. She didn't run. She didn't fight. She simply walked out to the car park and was taken in. At first, she said every killing was self-defense, that she felt threatened every single time. But the evidence piled up. Over 1 year, 7 men had vanished after picking up a hitchhiker who looked exactly like her. Their abandoned cars, their belongings, the repeating pattern. It all pointed back at Aileen. The trial dragged her into national headlines. Angry outbursts, shifting explanations, interviews that made the case even stranger. But the verdict stayed the same. Guilty. She was sentenced to death, and after years of appeals, she was executed in 2002. Tyria never faced charges. Her immunity deal held. She faded into a quiet life far from Florida and has avoided the spotlight ever since. John Wayne Gacy's early life began in a modest Chicago home in 1942, where the foundations of his personality were shaped long before anyone knew his name. He grew up in a working-class family, the middle child with 2 sisters, in an environment that mixed routine American life with simmering emotional tension. His father, a World War I veteran and machinist, carried the hardness of a man who believed discipline was the only path to strength. His mother was the opposite, gentle, protective, and always trying to soften the blows that came from the other side of the room. From the moment he could talk, Gacy seemed to search for acceptance. He wanted approval, especially from his father, but rarely got it. Small accomplishments were shrugged off. Mistakes were magnified. He was criticized for being soft, for crying easily, or for staying close to his mother. His father often saw vulnerability where there was only childhood, and he didn't hide his disappointment. The contrast between a father demanding toughness and a son craving warmth shaped a quiet storm inside the boy. Health problems added another layer. Gacy was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that caused him to faint unexpectedly. His body couldn't handle strenuous activity, and this placed him further apart from other boys his age. While they ran and played, he stayed inside or moved carefully, hoping to avoid another episode. Instead of sympathy, he was accused of exaggerating or pretending to gain attention. Even when medical tests confirmed the issue, the distrust lingered. These limitations isolated him. School became a struggle not because of academics, but because he often wasn't there. Frequent hospital visits, periods of weakness, and days spent recovering meant he missed lessons and social connections. Children can be unforgiving, and Gacy often felt like an outsider looking in, watching friendships form around him, but rarely being part of them. Around age 7, he suffered a significant blow to the head from a playground incident that left him with a blood clot. For years, it went untreated and contributed to his fainting spells and health problems. It wasn't corrected until he was older, and even then the damage to his confidence had already taken root. The combination of illness, ridicule, and emotional neglect shaped the way he viewed himself. Someone on the edge of acceptance, but never fully inside it. He found escape in helping his mother around the house, cooking, cleaning, or running errands. In a different situation, those might have been simple family chores, but in his home, they became fuel for further criticism. His father saw them as signs of weakness rather than willingness, reinforcing the idea that Gacy wasn't living up to his expectations of manhood. This deepened the divide between them and strengthened the boy's reliance on his mother's approval. Despite these struggles, Gacy showed signs of wanting to be noticed in positive ways. He joined school activities when he could, tried to make friends, and looked for spaces where he felt useful. Teachers often remembered him as polite, eager to please, and willing to work when his health allowed it. But underneath that effort was a child learning early that praise was rare, affection was conditional, and acceptance had to be earned rather than given freely. Adolescence didn't ease the pressure. His relationship with his father remained tense, sometimes silent, sometimes explosive. always unpredictable. Gacy tried part-time jobs, joined social groups, and attempted to build a sense of identity outside his home, but the unresolved feelings from childhood, fear of rejection, yearning for approval, and resentment of constant criticism followed him closely. By the time he reached his late teens, the pattern was set. A boy who smiled publicly while feeling small privately, someone who craved validation but didn't know how to get it in healthy ways, and someone who learned to hide parts of himself to avoid judgment. Those early lessons in secrecy, identity, and the need to project an image would later become central to the adult he became. When Gacy eventually stepped into adulthood, he carried the echoes of his early home with him. The insecurity, the desire to be liked, the resentment toward those who dismissed him, and the double life he learned to perform as a child were all ingredients waiting for a spark. His early life didn't explain everything, but it formed the emotional blueprint, the place where masks were learned long before they were ever worn in public. When Gacy left home as a young adult, he spent a short period working at a city mortuary. It was late-night work in a quiet building, surrounded by silence and responsibility. For someone already struggling with loneliness and internal conflict, the environment had a lasting effect. He left suddenly after a few months, but the experience stayed with him and seemed to influence the path his life gradually followed. Back in Chicago, he tried to build something stable. He married, moved to Iowa, and earned a management position at a family restaurant. On the surface, he looked like a man getting his life together, eager to be helpful, ambitious, and respected. He joined a local community group, putting on the same charm he used throughout his early life. But privately, he began crossing boundaries with younger individuals connected to the group. He offered them attention, gifts, and access to things they wouldn't normally have, slowly testing how much control he could exert. Eventually, one of these situations reached a point where the truth had to be confronted. A complaint was made, and despite Gacy denying everything, investigators found enough evidence to take the matter seriously. He was convicted and sent to prison. Prison should have been a turning point, but Gacy quickly learned how to adapt. He became the model inmate, volunteering for jobs, helping with improvements to the kitchen, and behaving exactly how staff wanted an inmate to behave. He gained the trust of officers and administrators, shaping himself into someone who looked cooperative and reformed. His performance earned him early release long before his original sentence was expected to end. When he returned to Chicago, he moved back in with his mother and began building a small construction business. This job gave him access to young men looking for quick work or a place to belong. To them, he appeared generous, offering meals, lifts, and wages. But behind closed doors, Gacy used these opportunities to test people's trust and vulnerability. He often introduced a trick involving a pair of handy cuffs, demonstrating how he could lock himself in and easily escape. Once he convinced someone else to try the same demonstration, the tone of the situation shifted. By the time they realized there was no simple way out, Gacy had assumed complete control. What followed had a pattern he refined over the years. Individuals who entered his home expecting payment or hospitality found themselves in situations they could not back out of. Some were overpowered through manipulation, fear, or the sudden change in his behavior. Many didn't survive these encounters. Over time, he developed a method that relied on a loop of cord tightened with a short piece of wood, something he chillingly referred to as a trick. Once a person lost consciousness, Gacy acted with cold certainty. To hide what he had done, he used the crawl space beneath his home, a low, cramped area supported by wooden beams. He treated it like a private storage ground, returning repeatedly when another disappearance needed to be covered. When the space became too crowded, he quietly found other ways to move remains, including transporting some to local waterways. All the while, he maintained his public persona. He became active in local politics, attended meetings, hosted gatherings, and even performed as a clown at community events. Neighbors saw a friendly man who helped organize block parties and supported charities. They had no idea that many of the young men who passed through his home never left. As the years passed, the pattern only grew bolder.
Hey there. Need a lift?
Oh, hi. Yeah, maybe. Where to?
Into town. I'm heading that way.
Okay, thanks.
Gacy no longer relied solely on the casual interaction of giving someone work or offering a lift home. He began actively seeking out people who were isolated, struggling, or simply passing through the city. He knew how to present himself as helpful and trustworthy, and he used that image to draw people into situations they could not easily escape. Some were promised quick cash for a day's labor, others were offered a warm meal or temporary shelter. The invitations sounded ordinary, but once inside his home, the balance of power shifted sharply in his favor. Police across the region were aware that young men were disappearing, but each case seemed disconnected. Some were travelers, some had unstable family lives, some had moved between cities. Without a clear thread tying them together, the disappearances looked like isolated tragedies rather than part of a larger pattern. Gacy counted on this confusion. He kept an organized schedule, maintained his business, and remained fully involved in local community work, which made him appear reliable to anyone who might have questioned him. His double life depended on blending in, and he had become extremely skilled at doing just that. Inside his home, the situation changed instantly. When someone realized they had put themselves in danger, it was usually too late. Gacy relied on surprise, intimidation, and the confidence he had spent years building. His method became so routine that it hardly changed from one encounter to the next. He used the same trick again and again, tightening control until the person lost consciousness. Afterwards, he returned to the crawl space, treating it like part of a grim routine. The area became increasingly crowded and difficult to manage, yet he kept using it, convinced he could continue without being caught. By the late 1970s, however, cracks began to appear in the image he presented to the world. People close to the missing individual started pushing harder for answers. Certain details surfaced: sightings, last known addresses, names mentioned in passing. And a pattern finally began to form. Gacy still behaved as though nothing was wrong. He hosted gatherings, joined community events, and offered help to neighbors. His confidence had grown to the point where he believed he could talk his way out of anything. What changed everything was a single disappearance that could not be dismissed. Investigators took it seriously from the beginning, interviewing witnesses, tracing movements, and following every lead. For the first time, the trail pointed directly at Gacy's house. When officers visited him for questioning, they noticed inconsistencies in his story. His behavior shifted from friendly cooperation to irritation whenever they pushed for details he couldn't control. Police kept returning, each time gathering more evidence, each visit tightening the circle around him. As suspicion grew, officers eventually obtained a warrant to search the property. They expected to find something linked to the missing individual, maybe clothing, paperwork, or signs of an encounter. What they discovered was far worse. The first sign came from beneath the house, the unmistakable smell rising from the crawl space. It was so strong that the officers immediately realized this was no isolated disappearance. The discovery triggered a full excavation, revealing the scale of what had been hidden beneath the floorboards. The truth unraveled quickly after that. Gacy's public persona collapsed, replaced by the reality of what he had been doing for years. Investigators uncovered the remains of numerous individuals in the crawl space, each connected to the pattern he had created. When confronted with the evidence, he alternated between denial, minimizing, and long, rambling explanations. But none of it could disguise what had happened. The facade he had built around himself for so long finally fell apart, revealing the magnitude of his crimes and the years of deception that had kept him hidden in plain sight. When the case finally reached court, the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had traced missing men to his home, recovered items linking him to disappearances, and uncovered the grim details hidden beneath the house. In the courtroom, the man who once blended into community events and local politics was forced to face the full weight of what had been uncovered. During the trial, he tried to present himself as someone misunderstood, someone who had been pushed by circumstances. He shifted between confidence, denial, and dramatic outbursts, hoping to sway the jury. But the testimony of experts, investigators, and survivors painted a much clearer picture. The prosecution laid out a pattern of manipulation, control, and deliberate planning. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't confusion. It was a sustained campaign built on taking advantage of vulnerable people who crossed his path. The defense attempted to argue diminished responsibility, suggesting that he had been influenced by childhood trauma and periods of personal instability. But the jury saw the consistency in his actions, the repeated methods, the calculated decisions, the attempts to hide what he had done. After weeks of evidence, the verdict was decisive. He was found guilty on multiple counts, each tied to an individual life that had been taken from the community. Sentencing reflected the scale of the crimes. The judge emphasized the level of planning involved and the years of concealment. There was no chance of returning to normal life, no possibility of blending in again. He was sent to a high-security facility to begin serving his time, a place far removed from the neighborhood gatherings and civic clubs where he once presented himself as helpful and harmless. Prison removed all the masks he had used for so long. Here, there were no community members to charm, no young men to lure with promises of work, and no political events where he could pose as a respectable citizen. Yet even inside the system, he tried to shape how others saw him. He gave interviews, wrote letters, and attempted to portray himself as a victim of misunderstanding. Guards and inmates alike described him as someone who constantly sought attention, a man who could not accept being forgotten. After his conviction, Gacy spent 14 years on death row. During that time, he filed appeals, gave interviews, painted, and continued insisting he was innocent, even as the evidence against him was overwhelming. His execution was carried out at Stateville Correctional Center. On May 10, 1994, at the age of 52, John Wayne Gacy was put to death by lethal injection. For many, his death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. For the families affected, it brought a measure of closure, though nothing could ever undo the pain he caused. In the early 1990s, when Milwaukee slept behind locked doors and half-drawn curtains, one man walked among the crowds unnoticed. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a quiet figure with soft eyes, a gentle way of speaking, and a darkness so deep even seasoned detectives later struggled to understand it. Born in 1960, Dahmer wasn't the explosive type. No shouting, no theatrics, just an unsettling calm, like he lived behind a pane of glass the rest of the world couldn't see through. His neighbors barely noticed him. The guy who kept to himself, the one who offered a shy smile in the hallway. But inside apartment 213, he created a universe of controls, obsession, and horror. A place where reality bent toward his compulsions, and no one truly knew what happened past that yellow door. For years, police crossed paths with Dahmer without realizing who they were dealing with. Victims escaped, reporting bizarre stories. Yet somehow he slipped back into anonymity, hiding behind that same soft voice and carefully rehearsed politeness. He blended into the noise of the city like a ghost with a pulse. But on a humid night in 1991, a handcuffed man sprinted into the street. The facade cracked, and when officers stepped inside that apartment, the air itself felt wrong. Photographs, tools, carefully arranged remains, each object whispering the truth. Dahmer never spoke out loud. The calm exterior was gone. His own words later painted the picture. He wasn't driven by rage, but by a need to freeze time and keep people from leaving him. Dahmer didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply sat in the interview room and unraveled the story of a double life with chilling detail. The city, the country, the world stared in disbelief. How had someone so invisible walked among them for so long? Jeffrey Dahmer is more than a headline. He's the reminder that monsters don't always roar. Some whisper politely while hiding their world in plain sight. The moment the tape recorder clicked on, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask what the charges were. He simply lowered his eyes and began speaking. Calmly, clearly, as if the words had been waiting for years. He confessed immediately. He told detectives he had planned his encounters. He told them he had selected men he thought were vulnerable, isolated, or simply willing to trust a quiet stranger. He explained how he would approach them with offers of money, drinks, or a place to relax. There was no anger in his voice, just a plain, steady recounting of events that left the room silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Detectives asked him why he kept bringing people back to his home. His answer came without emotion. He didn't want them to leave. He spoke openly about his obsession with control, not in a violent, chaotic sense, but in a deeply psychological way. He said he feared abandonment more than anything. He feared people disappearing from his life the moment he let them out the door. So he tried to prevent them from leaving at all. He admitted he wanted individuals who would stay exactly where he placed them, who wouldn't reject him, who wouldn't walk away once the night was over. As detectives pushed for details, Dahmer described the pattern that shaped his crimes. He met someone, he brought them home, and once they were inside, he was terrified the moment of companionship would end. He said the silence of his life felt unbearable. He said the idea of waking up alone the next morning was worse. So every time someone tried to leave, every time a conversation drifted, or the night wound down, that old fear returned. The fear that the loneliness he'd lived with since his teens would swallow him whole again. He admitted that the crimes themselves weren't driven by rage or impulse. They were driven by a twisted need to stop time, to freeze a moment of connection and keep it from disappearing. Detectives listened as he calmly mapped out years of encounters. He remembered names, streets, bars, bus stops. He remembered the clothes people wore, the music playing, the time of night. He remembered the parts that made him feel less alone, the conversations, the laughter, the brief companionship. And every time he reached the point where those moments would normally end, he acted to stop them ending. He told the detectives in the same quiet voice that he knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it from the very beginning. He said he wasn't driven by thrill or hatred. He said he acted because he felt empty, disconnected, terrified that no one would ever stay. Throughout the confession, detectives noted how rarely he lifted his head, how he spoke like someone describing a routine, how he didn't try to shock them or soften the truth, how he didn't cry, raise his voice, or attempt to justify what he'd done. He simply told them what happened. Step by step, victim by victim, year by year. And as the hours passed, the detectives realized they weren't listening to a man trying to escape responsibility. They were listening to a man who had finally run out of places to hide, someone whose entire world had been built around avoiding abandonment, and who was now facing the ultimate form of it: complete isolation. By the time he finished talking, the tape recorder had filled reels of audio. Detectives had pages of notes. And the weight of the confession, its detail, its clarity, its chilling calmness, left the room silent. For the first time in over a decade, Dahmer no longer had control. And he didn't fight that fact. He accepted it, quietly, completely, as if the confession itself was the only honest thing he had left to give. Inside that interrogation room, Jeffrey Dahmer finally began to explain what he had done. He admitted to taking the lives of 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. His method was chillingly calculated. Dahmer said he targeted people who were vulnerable or alone, luring them back to his apartment with offers of money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside, he incapacitated them. He told detectives that he wanted complete control over his victims, and that he hated the idea of anyone leaving him. During questioning, Dahmer described one of the most disturbing details of his pattern. He began drilling small holes into his victims' skulls while they were unconscious, attempting to create what he called a zombie-like state. He injected chemicals into the cavities, hoping they would stay alive but completely passive. These attempts never worked. Detectives said Dahmer explained all of this with an eerie calmness. No emotion, no hesitation, as if he was describing routine tasks. By the end of the interview, investigators understood the full scale of his crimes. 17 murders, carried out over more than a decade, all hidden behind the walls of his Milwaukee apartment. After Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, investigators uncovered a long list of failures that had allowed him to keep killing for years. One of the most shocking moments came from an event in May 1991, when a 14-year-old boy, Konarak Synthesophone, escaped Dahmer's apartment, drugged and disoriented. Two women tried to help him and called police. But when officers arrived, Dahmer managed to convince them that Konarak was an adult boyfriend who had simply had too much to drink. Despite the boy's obvious injuries, the officers accepted Dahmer's explanation. They returned Konarak to the apartment, unaware that Dahmer had already targeted him. This tragedy became one of the most heavily criticized failures in modern policing. As the case moved toward trial, Dahmer's crimes captured nationwide attention. In early 1992, he was charged with multiple counts of murder committed between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer pleaded guilty, but not guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyers claimed he suffered from severe psychological disturbances. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that Dahmer planned his crimes, understood right from wrong, and carried out each step with clear intent. After hearing weeks of testimony from mental health experts, detectives, and victims' families, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Dahmer was found legally sane and fully responsible. He received life imprisonment plus 999 years, ensuring he would never be released. Inside Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution, Dahmer initially stayed in protective isolation, but was eventually moved into the general population. While imprisoned, he took on cleaning duties, read constantly, and spent long periods discussing religion. He participated in televised interviews, speaking calmly about his crimes and expressing a belief that prison was the only place he deserved to be. His interviews with Inside Edition and MSNBC drew huge audiences due to his emotionless, matter-of-fact tone. Dahmer also maintained contact with his parents. His father, Lionel Dahmer, visited regularly, searching for answers about his son's behavior. His mother, Joy, wrote letters and remained in contact despite the horror surrounding the case. Their relationship with Jeffrey in prison was distant, but continued until his death. Over time, Dahmer developed a dark sense of humor that angered inmates, making disturbing jokes and acting in ways that many saw as taunting. Prison staff noted rising tension around him, despite attempts to monitor his safety. On November 28, 1994, that tension erupted. Dahmer was assigned to a small work detail with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The three were left unsupervised while cleaning a prison area. Scarver attacked both men with a metal bar taken from exercise equipment. Dahmer received fatal injuries and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 34 years old. Scarver later stated that he believed Dahmer had mocked him and that he felt compelled to act. Others suggested the crime stemmed from resentment over Dahmer's notoriety and the nature of his offenses. Regardless of motive, the incident exposed major security failures inside the prison. Jeffrey Dahmer's death brought mixed reactions across the country. Some saw it as justice. Others believed he should have lived out his full sentence. For the families of victims, it marked the end of a man who had taken so much, but not the end of the pain he left behind. Jeffrey Dahmer's story remains one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Not just because of his actions, but because of the failures that allowed him to continue for so long. His life became a disturbing mix of isolation, obsession, and opportunity, shaped by personal struggles and missed warnings at every stage. In the end, his crimes forced police departments, psychologists, and entire communities to confront uncomfortable questions about mental health, vulnerability, and the limits of the justice system. His trial, his time in prison, and his eventual death all became part of a case that continues to be studied to this day. For many, the legacy of this story is not about the man himself, but about the victims, the families affected, and the lessons learned. It's a reminder of why vigilance, accountability, and awareness matter, because when they fail, the consequences can echo for decades. This has been the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, a case that continues to challenge, disturb, and teach us even now. And remember, the world is full of people living behind closed doors, hiding their true intentions. So the next time you're at a bar, on a bus, or sitting on a late-night train, ask yourself one chilling question. Who's really sitting beside you? Tonight, we revisit one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in American history. A killer who mocked the police, terrorized a city, and left behind ciphers that experts still can't fully solve. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, a case that remains open more than 50 years later. Between 1968 and 1969, the Zodiac operated across Northern California. He targeted couples, ambushed victims in isolated areas, and phoned the police to brag about it. He claimed responsibility for as many as 37 murders, though only 5 are officially confirmed. But what made this case truly terrifying wasn't just the attacks themselves, it was what came next. The Zodiac didn't simply vanish into the night. He reached out. He wanted the world to know his name. Within months, letters began arriving at local newspapers. Messages filled with strange symbols, threats, and puzzles he demanded the public solve. It was the start of a twisted game, one that captured the attention of an entire country and has kept investigators busy for more than 50 years. The letter was unlike anything the newsroom had ever seen. It wasn't just a confession, it was a challenge. The writer claimed responsibility for several attacks and demanded that his message be printed on the front page, or more people would die. Alongside the threats were pages of bizarre symbols, coded messages he insisted the public decode.
This letter is a direct threat. We have to publish it. But what if it incites panic? We need to verify. The police say hold it. We could be liable. We're sitting on a powder keg here.
For investigators and journalists, this was the moment the case changed. The Zodiac wasn't hiding. He wanted to be heard. As investigators searched the letter for any trace of who sent it, one thing became clear. This wasn't the work of someone acting on impulse. Every detail, every word, every symbol had been carefully planned. The message wasn't just meant to terrify, it was meant to be studied. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with a random attacker, but someone who wanted attention, control, and a growing audience. And the more they examined the letter, the more they understood that this was only the beginning. Once the name appeared, everything changed. Reporters, detectives, and even ordinary citizens began searching for clues in every line of the letter. Was the writer revealing his identity? Was he taunting investigators, or was it all part of a larger plan? What they didn't know at the time was that this would be the first of many messages, each one more calculated, more cryptic, and more disturbing than the last. Once the name appeared, everything changed. Reporters, detectives, and even ordinary citizens began searching for clues in every line of the letter. Was the writer revealing his identity? Was he taunting investigators, or was it all part of a larger plan? What they didn't know at the time was that this would be the first of many messages, each one more calculated, more cryptic, and more disturbing than the last. Witnesses later described a figure who seemed to appear and disappear in the darkness. A presence that didn't run, didn't hide, but simply watched. The fear came not just from what he did, but from the feeling that he could be anywhere. On the road, behind the trees, or standing silently in the fog. For investigators, it became clear that whoever was behind these attacks understood the power of fear, and he used it as part of his plan. The case begins on December 20th, 1968, on a remote stretch of Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. Teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were parked in their car when a vehicle pulled up beside them. Moments later, both were attacked without warning. Betty Lou was found outside the vehicle while David was discovered still inside. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and the killer vanished into the night. This attack marked the beginning of what would soon be known as the Zodiac case. When officers first looked inside the car, they were faced with a scene that raised more questions than answers. Two young people, both unresponsive, both attacked without any sign of struggle. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no footprints leading away from the road. Nothing to explain how the attacker approached, carried out the shooting, and disappeared into the darkness. What investigators did know was this: the strike was precise, fast, and deliberately planned. And whoever was responsible was just getting started. And that was the biggest problem for investigators. They had no idea who they were dealing with. No motive, no signature, no clear target. Just a ruthless attacker who struck without warning and vanished before anyone could react. But this was only the beginning. Within months, he would attack again, and this time, he would make sure the world knew his name. On July 4th, 1969, the attacker struck again. This time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. 22-year-old Darlene Ferran and 19-year-old Mike Mageau were sitting in a parked car when a second vehicle pulled up behind them. What happened next followed the same pattern as before: a sudden, unprovoked attack.
It's so quiet out here.
Yeah, just us.
I like it.
Me too.
Carried out with cold precision. But unlike the first incident, this time, one survivor lived to tell investigators exactly what happened. And from his hospital bed, he told investigators everything he remembered. He described a man emerging from the darkness, a silent figure with a flashlight, and then the gunfire. From his hospital bed, the survivor gave investigators their first real description of the attacker. He spoke of a man who approached with a flashlight, pretending to be a police officer before opening fire without hesitation. It wasn't just the brutality that shocked detectives. It was the cold confidence behind it. This was someone who planned every step. And he wasn't finished. But investigators wouldn't have long to wait. On the night of July 4th, 1969, at Blue Rock Springs Park, another couple was ambushed in a sudden burst of gunfire. This attack confirmed their worst fear. The killer was still out there, and he was escalating. Just minutes after the shooting, the killer made a move no one expected. He picked up the phone, called police dispatch himself, and calmly reported the attack, even claiming responsibility for the earlier murders. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. For investigators, this was the moment they realized they weren't dealing with a typical offender, but someone who wanted to be heard. The call was traced to a payphone just a few miles from the crime scene. When officers arrived, the phone was still hanging off the hook, but the caller was gone. In that brief message, he described the attack in exact detail. Details only the shooter could have known. For detectives, this was the moment the case changed forever. For the first time, the killer wasn't just attacking. He was communicating. He wanted credit, he wanted attention, and most of all, he wanted control. And within weeks, he would send a series of letters that would terrify the entire Bay Area and make his name known around the world. Control was exactly what he wanted. With his next move, the killer shifted from attacking in the shadows to commanding the headlines. He began sending letters straight to the newspapers, coded messages, threats, and demands, each one designed to force the world to pay attention. The codes came without warning. Pages filled with strange symbols, threats, and puzzles. He mailed them directly to the newspapers, daring the public to solve his secrets. And with every letter, his message grew louder. He wanted fear, attention, and complete control. 2 months later, the killer resurfaced far from the city and skied at Lake Berryessa. On a quiet autumn afternoon, a young couple relaxing near the water was approached by a man wearing a black hood and a strange symbol on his chest. This time, the attack was different. Quieter, more personal, and far more brutal. And once again, he left a message only he could have written. What happened next would become one of the Zodiac's most chilling encounters. The hooded attacker tied the couple's hands, claiming he only needed their car. But moments later, he revealed a knife and turned the scene into a brutal assault. The young woman did not survive her injuries, but the man, though severely wounded, lived just long enough to describe the attacker's eerie calm and methodical behavior. It was this survivor's testimony that confirmed investigators' worst fears. The Zodiac had now shifted from gun attacks to something far more personal and far more terrifying. Despite the fear, the codes were printed, and people across the country tried to solve them. But in the end, it wasn't the police or FBI who cracked the Zodiac's most famous cipher. It was a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty. Working from their kitchen table, they decoded the message letter by letter, revealing the killer's disturbing thoughts but no clue to his identity. Even when solved, the Zodiac's message only raised more questions. The decoded message gave investigators a chilling look into the killer's mind, but it still didn't reveal his name. And despite the clues, the taunts, and the escalating violence, the Zodiac simply vanished back into the shadows. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some point to Arthur Lee Allen, others to Richard Gaikowski, Lawrence Kane, or even newer DNA-based suspects. But the truth is simple. The Zodiac killer has never been officially identified. No arrests, no confirmed name. Just a trail of fear, letters, and puzzles that continue to haunt investigators even today. And to this day, the case remains open. Tonight, we revisit one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in American history. A killer who mocked the police, terrorized a city, and left behind ciphers that experts still can't fully solve. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, a case that remains open more than 50 years later. Between 1968 and 1969, the Zodiac operated across Northern California. He targeted couples, ambushed victims in isolated areas, and phoned the police to brag about it. He claimed responsibility for as many as 37 murders, though only 5 are officially confirmed. But what made this case truly terrifying wasn't just the attacks themselves, it was what came next. The Zodiac didn't simply vanish into the night. He reached out. He wanted the world to know his name. Within months, letters began arriving at local newspapers. Messages filled with strange symbols, threats, and puzzles he demanded the public solve. It was the start of a twisted game, one that captured the attention of an entire country and has kept investigators busy for more than 50 years. The letter was unlike anything the newsroom had ever seen. It wasn't just a confession, it was a challenge. The writer claimed responsibility for several attacks and demanded that his message be printed on the front page, or more people would die. Alongside the threats were pages of bizarre symbols, coded messages he insisted the public decode.
This letter is a direct threat. We have to publish it. But what if it incites panic? We need to verify. The police say hold it. We could be liable. We're sitting on a powder keg here.
For investigators and journalists, this was the moment the case changed. The Zodiac wasn't hiding. He wanted to be heard. As investigators searched the letter for any trace of who sent it, one thing became clear. This wasn't the work of someone acting on impulse. Every detail, every word, every symbol had been carefully planned. The message wasn't just meant to terrify, it was meant to be studied. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with a random attacker, but someone who wanted attention, control, and a growing audience. And the more they examined the letter, the more they understood that this was only the beginning. Once the name appeared, everything changed. Reporters, detectives, and even ordinary citizens began searching for clues in every line of the letter. Was the writer revealing his identity? Was he taunting investigators, or was it all part of a larger plan? What they didn't know at the time was that this would be the first of many messages, each one more calculated, more cryptic, and more disturbing than the last. Once the name appeared, everything changed. Reporters, detectives, and even ordinary citizens began searching for clues in every line of the letter. Was the writer revealing his identity? Was he taunting investigators, or was it all part of a larger plan? What they didn't know at the time was that this would be the first of many messages, each one more calculated, more cryptic, and more disturbing than the last. Witnesses later described a figure who seemed to appear and disappear in the darkness. A presence that didn't run, didn't hide, but simply watched. The fear came not just from what he did, but from the feeling that he could be anywhere. On the road, behind the trees, or standing silently in the fog. For investigators, it became clear that whoever was behind these attacks understood the power of fear, and he used it as part of his plan. The case begins on December 20th, 1968, on a remote stretch of Lake Herman Road in Benicia, California. Teenagers David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were parked in their car when a vehicle pulled up beside them. Moments later, both were attacked without warning. Betty Lou was found outside the vehicle while David was discovered still inside. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, and the killer vanished into the night. This attack marked the beginning of what would soon be known as the Zodiac case. When officers first looked inside the car, they were faced with a scene that raised more questions than answers. Two young people, both unresponsive, both attacked without any sign of struggle. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no footprints leading away from the road. Nothing to explain how the attacker approached, carried out the shooting, and disappeared into the darkness. What investigators did know was this. The strike was precise, fast, and deliberately planned. And whoever was responsible was just getting started. And that was the biggest problem for investigators. They had no idea who they were dealing with. No motive, no signature, no clear target. Just a ruthless attacker who struck without warning and vanished before anyone could react. But this was only the beginning. Within months, he would attack again, and this time, he would make sure the world knew his name. On July 4th, 1969, the attacker struck again. This time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. 22-year-old Darlene Farran and 19-year-old Mike Mageau were sitting in a parked car when a second vehicle pulled up behind them. What happened next followed the same pattern as before. A sudden, unprovoked attack.
It's so quiet out here.
Yeah, just us.
I like it.
Me too.
Carried out with cold precision. But unlike the first incident, this time, one survivor lived to tell investigators exactly what happened. And from his hospital bed, he told investigators everything he remembered. He described a man emerging from the darkness. A silent figure with a flashlight. And then the gunfire. From his hospital bed, the survivor gave investigators their first real description of the attacker. He spoke of a man who approached with a flashlight, pretending to be a police officer before opening fire without hesitation. It wasn't just the brutality that shocked detectives. It was the cold confidence behind it. This was someone who planned every step. And he wasn't finished. But investigators wouldn't have long to wait. On the night of July 4th, 1969, at Blue Rock Springs Park, another couple was ambushed in a sudden burst of gunfire. This attack confirmed their worst fear. The killer was still out there, and he was escalating. Just minutes after the shooting, the killer made a move no one expected. He picked up the phone, called police dispatch himself, and calmly reported the attack, even claiming responsibility for the earlier murders. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. For investigators, this was the moment they realized they weren't dealing with a typical offender, but someone who wanted to be heard. The call was traced to a payphone just a few miles from the crime scene. When officers arrived, the phone was still hanging off the hook, but the caller was gone. In that brief message, he described the attack in exact detail. Details only the shooter could have known. For detectives, this was the moment the case changed forever. For the first time, the killer wasn't just attacking. He was communicating. He wanted credit, he wanted attention, and most of all, he wanted control. And within weeks, he would send a series of letters that would terrify the entire Bay Area and make his name known around the world. Control was exactly what he wanted. With his next move, the killer shifted from attacking in the shadows to commanding the headlines. He began sending letters straight to the newspapers, coded messages, threats, and demands, each one designed to force the world to pay attention. The codes came without warning, pages filled with strange symbols, threats, and puzzles. He mailed them directly to the newspapers, daring the public to solve his secrets. And with every letter, his message grew louder. He wanted fear, attention, and complete control. 2 months later, the killer resurfaced far from the city and keyed at Lake Berryessa. On a quiet autumn afternoon, a young couple relaxing near the water was approached by a man wearing a black hood and a strange symbol on his chest. This time, the attack was different. Quieter, more personal, and far more brutal. And once again, he left a message only he could have written. What happened next would become one of the Zodiac's most chilling encounters. The hooded attacker tied the couple's hands, claiming he only needed their car. But moments later, he revealed a knife and turned the scene into a brutal assault. The young woman did not survive her injuries, but the man, though severely wounded, lived just long enough to describe the attacker's eerie calm and methodical behavior. It was this survivor's testimony that confirmed investigators' worst fears. The Zodiac had now shifted from gun attacks to something far more personal and far more terrifying. Despite the fear, the codes were printed, and people across the country tried to solve them. But in the end, it wasn't the police or FBI who cracked the Zodiac's most famous cipher. It was a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty. Working from their kitchen table, they decoded the message letter by letter, revealing the killer's disturbing thoughts but no clue to his identity. Even when solved, the Zodiac's message only raised more questions. The decoded message gave investigators a chilling look into the killer's mind, but it still didn't reveal his name. And despite the clues, the taunts, and the escalating violence, the Zodiac simply vanished back into the shadows. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. Some point to Arthur Lee Allen, others to Richard Gaikowski, Lawrence Kane, or even newer DNA-based suspects. But the truth is simple. The Zodiac killer has never been officially identified. No arrests, no confirmed name. Just a trail of fear, letters, and puzzles that continue to haunt investigators even today. And to this day, the case remains open.